I'm Brenda. I am your gravestone girl for the evening. And I'm going to just jump right into it. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get this started because we have a lot of ground to cover tonight. All righty, here we go. Are we ready? So if you do me all a favor, make sure you've muted yourselves. Oops, what happened? Make sure that you mute yourselves. I don't want to have to talk over you. And also, it's not good for the recording quality. So we want to try to be as professional as possible. All right. So I'm going to do one more thing. I can see you all. If you can hear me, just give me some thumbs up. All right, cool. Because if I'm sitting here talking to myself, I have no way of knowing. All right. So let us go. If I can get one thing to work here, here we go. All right, cool. So welcome to the graveyard. This is your tour of cemetery art and history and symbolism with the Gravestone Girls. That upper left-hand picture is a shot of the Gravestone Girls in their natural habitat. That's me, Brenda, in glasses and the purple boots, the sunglasses. I very rarely go anywhere without them. My wonderful beloved web mistress, Zipporah, is to the left. She's standing with the beautiful handmade scarf on. She does all our social media and makes sure that we look good on the internet. And then seated is my unconventional conventionalist. That's Maggie. She's my best friend since the age of way back when. I don't put a number on that anymore. But we're all from Massachusetts. And we all still live in Massachusetts. Maggie and I grew up in Central Mass, and Melissa grew up out in Western Mass. And together and separately, we have been traversing cemeteries and graveyards all over the world for many years. Gravestone Girls' mission is to keep our dead alive by preserving cemetery art and history. Shameless self-promotion, www.gravestonegirls.com. And you can also find us on social media on Facebook and Instagram at Gravestone Girls. If you are not already following us, please do. I like to see my numbers climb after every program. So Gravestone Girls do a bunch of different things. We do presentations like this. We lead cemetery walking tours. Do you remember getting together as groups and going out for a walk? We'll get back to those. The lower left-hand picture is an example of gravestone rubbing. We teach gravestone rubbing classes. It's a broad subject with a lot of detail that is a topic for another day. So we're not going to touch on that tonight. And then on the right-hand side, on the bottom, that picture is examples of our gravestone replicas. Gravestone Girls also make art from the faces of original New England gravestones, mostly from the colonial period. These are elements of the larger stones that are still found out on the cemetery landscape. Each one of them is handmade and hand finished. They all have hooks on the backs of them so they can hang on the wall. And we also make a line of magnets, and we do frames and mirrors and pin boards and all kinds of fun and useful decorative stuff. So that's how you find that stuff on gravestonegirls.com. So before we get going, we have to answer two basic questions about the origin and the evolution of the cemetery. And one of them is, why do we bury the dead? And the other is, where do gravestones really come from? So as humans, we have finite lives, right? So we bury the dead because we are only here for a certain amount of time. And when you bury the dead, someone dies, you dig a grave, you put the body in the grave. And early on, that grave was covered with a pile of stones. And that's where the word gravestone comes from. So the pile of stones were put on there to show you where you put someone in case you want to go back and visit or memorialize. You put stones on that grave to show where you put someone in the event that you bury someone else. You want to know who's already there so you don't disturb the ones that are already buried. And the third reason, and very good one, very practical, is they put piles of stones over the freshly turned earth so wild animals would not disturb the grave. The historic record back in the archaeological record will continuously show us time and time again that different civilizations at different periods of time all over the world had belief systems that said there was something else after this. And we know that because we find graves that have grave goods in them. So that picture in the top right is an example of a very simple interment. You can see the skeleton. And we have some vessels around the body that probably held something like food, oils, beads, something that would have been needed by the occupant for the next world. And really, aren't those big pointy things down below? Aren't those really just big old gravestones? And they mark the spot where Pharaoh is buried, and they contain wonderful things that Pharaoh needs for the next world. Now, while I can talk about 50,000 years worth of history, we don't have that kind of time. So I am going to bring us to the things that are most local to us here in the United States. And that would be the three major eras of gravestones, graveyards, and cemeteries, because there is a difference between graveyards and cemeteries, and it has to do with the time period. And I'm going to explain that as we go on. So the upper left-hand picture is an example of a very standard colonial landscape that comes into being from first settlement through the 1700s. On the top right, we have an example of the rural garden cemetery movement that takes place in the 19th century. And then down below, we have an example of a commonly occurring modern cemetery of the 20th and 21st century. This is the part where I'm going to tell you, I came to town not that long ago. I came to Pembroke and I went to all the cemeteries in town and I took pictures to build tonight's program. So most of what you'll see tonight is found in the graveyards and cemeteries in Pembroke. That being said, and I will warn you again when we get there to the modern section, I took pictures in all of your cemeteries, including pictures of your modern stones. I did the best I could to hide personal identities, tried not to pick something that was too new in terms of going out on the landscape representing a very current death, but I am including them in tonight's program as part of the evolutionary walk, as part of the examples of how we as modern people are thinking about ourselves, our mortality and memorialization, the same way that I'm using the gravestones from the colonial and the 19th century periods to illustrate how the folks of that time were thinking about their mortality and memorialization. So Pembroke was established in 1712 from Duxbury. This is a list in roughly pretty good chronological order of the cemeteries in the historic record of the town of Pembroke. So we got 1, 2, 3, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 15, as I thought. So I got to most of these. You will notice here that a couple of them say not found. And I might talk about that. I might ask you guys, some locals, some questions about that afterwards, but it's not impossible to, not out of the realm of possibility that they don't exist anymore, or they might be on private property where I couldn't get to them. And even in the case of that last one on the list, the historic record told me that that cemetery, that chapel burying ground, was moved in 1912 to Evergreen Cemetery in Kingston, Massachusetts. So not uncommon. So when you look at my slides this evening, they'll all have a caption on them. The first line will typically tell you what we're looking at. So here, this is a bunch of examples of colonial period graveyards. And then underneath it, it will say what cemeteries in Pembroke those are. So here are examples from the Briggs Cemetery and Center Cemetery as well. So this is stuff from town. And early on, graves are marked, if they're marked at all, from first period, from first settlement forward. If they're marked at all, they might use rough stones like we see in the upper left-hand corner. They might have used wooden markers, which we would have lost over time to decay and weathering. Early on, they don't have a lot of use for the idea of putting stones up. It's not practical. It's just not part of the lexicon at the time. And this is the Puritans and the Pilgrims we're talking about. On the upper right and lower right are examples of colonial New England landscapes. Examples here, both of those are of the Center Cemetery in Pembroke. When you see these spaces, know that what you're looking at has absolutely changed over time. And one of the telltale features is that they look pretty organized. They usually are set up in relatively nice, neat, straight lines. That's a good indication. That happens for a whole bunch of reasons. And I think I think Center in Pembroke is a really good example of that. So we move them around for a whole bunch of reasons over time. We move them around for landscaping. To be able to mow the lawn, take care of the grounds. We move them around as we build buildings and we put in roads or we widen roads where there were no roads or previously smaller roads before. The cemetery the graveyard gives up landscape for the buildings and the roads because they're typically located, often these oldest ones are buried, are located in the middle of town. So they are affected by the growth and prosperity and progress of the town. And also, there are certain time periods where just general aesthetics dictate that people take it upon themselves, and not just individuals, but organizations as well, take it upon themselves to go in and clean up. They go in and they tidy up because they look unruly and they're not visually pleasing. So all of these things can come into play when you're looking at these colonial New England burial grounds. Know that what you see has absolutely changed over time. And that bottom picture is a really good example of just the overall landscape, how everything's kind of nice and neat and lined up. And I put this one on the top right up there so you can see that road. That road came way after the cemetery, after the burial ground. And it caused this space to get reorganized. And I'll show you another example of how I know that later on in the next couple of slides. So, and again, this is a really good example of how I know that this space has been turned around. So gravestones have parts, just like anything else. So these two examples are from Center Cemetery in Pembroke, and they are typical colonial New England gravestones that start showing up on the landscape in the last quarter of the 1600s. They're typically made out of slate. And here, as you can see with both of them, on the left, this first round is called the shoulder. And then the larger arch where the art is contained is called the tympanum. And then I've got another shoulder over here on the right. So you've got examples of the same kind of stones in this picture. One of them, the one on the left, is backlit. So that's another tip to me that it's been turned around or moved around in the cemetery, and I'll explain in the next slide or two. And then the one down here on the lower right, it's got a lot of biological growth on it, so it makes it difficult to read, but they are there, and they are some of your originals in town, and both of those are firmly in the 1700s. So gravestones originally came in pairs too. So they had headstones and footstones. So the tall ones on the left are headstones. The little ones on the right are footstones. So the idea was, this is all Christian-based ideology and iconography. So the idea was, if you buried father and he was 6 feet tall, it would spread from his headstone to his footstone. You bury mother next to him, and and she's 5 feet tall, so there's a 5-foot spread between her headstone and her footstone. So if you follow that logic and apply it to this picture, looks like everybody was all the same height, right? That's what we can deduce from that. Nope. What we can deduce from that is another clue here that this space has indeed been reorganized over time. Those footstones have been pushed back and they make their own row. So isn't the row between the big ones and the little ones just about the right size for the lawnmower to go through? We move this stuff around for a number of reasons, including groundskeeping over time. You will know footstones because they will have something on them that ties them to the big one that they hopefully sit near. So if this one in the front, which actually doesn't have one behind it, but if the tall one has my name on it, Brenda P. Sullivan, and the little one directly behind it has my name or initials, that's its footstone. So you know the two of them go together. If the footstone directly behind the larger stone does not have the same initials or name, it's just another clue that this space has been changed over time. Also, because this was all Christian-based ideology, they're very religious, they're pretty superstitious, and they're really following the Bible to the letter. So the idea was, it was important that even the way you were buried in the ground had meaning. It had a particular purpose. So the idea is that the big stone here, it's called east-west axis orientation. So the big stones here are facing west. In terms of the inscriptions on the faces, they're facing west. The body is back here behind the headstone. And the idea is, on Judgment Day, the Archangel Gabriel is going to come from the east, sounding the call for resurrection by blowing his trumpet, and all the dead are going to sit up in their graves facing east. This is an important call. This is something you don't want to miss. All the work you did here comes down to how you are judged on that day. So when that trumpet blows, you better be ready to go, or you might get left behind and not get to go to the next land. That being said, I know that this space, another clue that I know this space has been reorganized is a lot of the writing on these stones are facing east, not west. So if I jump back one, that skull on the upper left is backlit. So the writing is facing east. I always go to the Colonial Burial Grounds in the afternoon, because if they're still oriented on east-west axis, when I get there in the afternoon, the sun will be shining on their faces and I'll be able to take good pictures. I often get foiled because they get turned around, they get changed around over time. And now some of the great art that are on them at 3 p.m. is now backlit, like you can see here. So again, just more examples of how these spaces turn around and get changed over time. It seems really crazy with our modern attitudes about historic preservation and the idea of the sacredness of a graveyard or a cemetery. It seems kind of crazy that we would move these things around, but know that these are all examples of reasons how these spaces do get changed over time. I get asked a lot about skulls on gravestones. You'll see this winged skull or this death's head on colonial New England gravestones starting after the middle of the 1600s. So they become very prominent starting in the last quarter of the 1600s and moving ahead. They carry right on into the 1700s. This is a soul symbol. The folks of the time, life is really hard. They're spending all their time really just trying to survive. So what you did here, you had one immortal soul. And what you did here was what you were judged on to determine whether that soul got to fly off to the next world upon your death. So the idea of using the skull is that, again, remember, very strict interpretation of the Bible. So when you die, the bones are what's left. And at the time, to carve something into stone that looked human or angelic to denote the idea of being human or heading off to the next world, to carve something that looked human or angelic into stone would have been considered a graven image and would have been sacrilegious. So we go the very literal route of putting bones and skulls, skeletons on these old colonial New England gravestones. And carvers carved in their own particular style. Different styles are seen in different regions, but a winged skull is a winged skull in its meaning in that time period, even though it's going to look different depending on the hand that carved it. As we come into the early 1700s, around the 1720s, there's a movement called the Great Awakening. And what it is more of an understanding of the relationship between us and our maker. And we still have the obligation to protect that one immortal soul that we have with the deeds that we do. But the idea is that our maker is understanding and benevolent and will judge us accordingly. We're still obligated to do the best work we are while we're here, but we're no longer in a situation where 50 years or so, 30 to 50 years prior to that, the slightest transgression might be the difference between going up or going down. So now you've got a little bit of latitude. You're still supposed to protect that immortal soul with your behavior, being a good person, a good member of the community, extolling the virtues of being righteous and useful. But you've still got that obligation to the immortal soul. So that winged skull that we saw previously as the soul symbol is now allowed to grow some skin and take on a human or an angelic look without now running the risk of being sacrilegious. It means exactly the same thing. It is just the modern symbol for the time. And at no time can you say, the winged skull stopped being used in 1718, and then it's just winged souls on from there. That's not how it works. The two symbols will continuously cross over through the 1700s with no trouble at all. And certainly down below on the left, that guy in profile, he's from town, and I wanted you to see him because the soul doesn't necessarily have to have wings. It is to be the idea of being human. So, other puritanical messages. That's all my fans calling in. Even then, we still get the interruptions. So, other puritanical messages, right? On the top left, again, another backlit stone from Center Cemetery. So it's just another clue in the afternoon that this has been turned around. And although it's got some damage and some, looks like some biological growth on it, it looks like a really fabulous winged skull. It's got a Latin phrase on it, and that Latin phrase reads, memento mori. So think about death, remember your mortality, remember you're going to die. We have words in Latin to remind you of your mortality on gravestones. We have a picture language of the skulls and the winged souls to remind you of your mortality. So that way you get the people that can read and write and those who cannot read and write. You make sure that you get every level of education. This is very much, whether you can read or not, that picture language is definitely a quick reminder. It is a visual cue for you to just do that check. How am I behaving today? Am I doing the right work? Am I being a good and virtuous person? As remember, these spaces were typically in the middle of town, the organized town burial grounds were typically in the middle of town. So as you go about your business over the course of the day, when you are there, you are walking by these pretty graven images, these dark images, very literal mortality symbols, looking out at you, reminding you about your own mortality. That beautiful stone on the left has a fabulous Latin message on it. But even in the 21st century, never mind the 17th or 18th century, I don't need to know Latin to know what's going on with that stone, what that message on that stone is. So there's a tree on that stone, and you are the tree. So the tree is like a human life. It has a definite beginning, it has a definite end, and it's a fragile object that can be interrupted. That life can be interrupted at any point in time. So what you have here is your maker coming out of the clouds with his hatchet to fell your tree. You don't know it's coming. It is inevitable. It is inescapable. And once he takes your tree down, that is the end of your opportunity to work for the salvation of the immortal soul. So it's the idea of always being vigilant and always being prepared and checking your behavior. But not to worry, death is not a permanent condition. Lightly inscribed on that lovely stone at the bottom of the screen says, the grave is God's hiding place. It is a very particular place. We live, we die, we go to the grave, and we wait. And this is what we're waiting for. We are waiting for the resurrection. We're waiting for Judgment Day, the call of Gabriel's trumpet for redemption of our sins, and then ascension to the next world, the reward for how you held up during your life in this very difficult physical world. Down below, that skull in the middle is death. He is also human mortality. And it says, all must submit to the king of terrors. Death was known as the king of all terrors, and all must submit. Some musician once wrote, nobody gets out of here alive. They knew that hundreds of years before that. But don't despair, keep reading. Through Christ, we conquer, rise, and reign forever. The promise that there is something more after this. As we come through the 1700s and we're coming into the close of the century, we have a revolution, literally. We have decided that we are going to strike off on our own as a nation, and founding fathers are looking for ideology to base this new nation on. So they look to the very ancient and very successful civilizations of the Greeks and the Romans, who were the founders of the concepts of democracy and the republic, the idea of the people governing themselves, and that very much fit with how we were approaching this by way of having a revolution. So while they're doing that, there is also real-time archaeology going on in places like Pompeii and Herculaneum and Greece and the far outposts of the Roman, of the ancient Roman settlement all across Europe. And that real-time archaeology is bringing those civilizations, those classic civilizations, to light for the first time in the 18th century. And what happens is it causes a craze, just like new things always do. So that classicism gets embraced by the modern people of the late 18th century, and it becomes neoclassicism. So it happens in the land of the living that the ancient style of architecture and furniture and dress are adopted by the land of the living in the buildings that we're building with pediments and columns and capitals, in the federal furniture, even in the style of dress and hairstyles. And while that's happening in the land of the living, it transfers right over into the land of the dead as well. And one of the big symbols that gets integrated into the burying ground and onto the faces of gravestones is, as this upper left-hand picture will show you, is an urn. And it is a specific urn. It was found in the ground as cinerary urns in these places that are having their excavations happening. As cinerary urns in the ancient world were used both because we had cremation, as well as they would let the bodies decay naturally, and then what was left was then put into these cinerary urns. So it's a beautiful metaphor for the metaphor of the living moving on to the dead, as well as the vessel that carries the body to the next world. So both literally and figuratively. And we also get trees again, like the example on the right, on the upper right, and it is a very specific tree. It's a weeping willow. And by virtue of what it's called and the way it looks, it is a perfect symbol for 18th into 19th century mourning and use on gravestones. So these are all examples from town, and we see them singularly, just the urn or just the willow, and then we see them together as the urn and willow motif, the definite beginning, a definite end, something living, something dead, And this becomes the dominant symbol all through the 1800s. This looks really different, doesn't it? So this is Mount Auburn Cemetery. And this is the first time in this country, a place where we bury our dead is called a cemetery. Even the word cemetery derives its origins from a Greek word that means sleeping place or dormitory. So it really, in and of itself, really reflects what the people of the time are thinking about mortality. So no more hatchets coming out of the sky and chopping your tree, no more bones. It's a much softer transition from this world to the next. You fall asleep, you pass away. This is also a climate where the writers of the time, the Hawthornes, Thoreaus, the Longfellows, Byron as a poet, and others are writing about nature. They're writing about communing with nature. They're writing about preserving nature. We have a move away from being an agrarian society. We're leaving the farms and we're coming into the city, and we're working in the factories. And the mechanizations of those factories are making goods that are making our lives easier. We are not just spending all our time trying to survive like the folks before us were. We also have the transcendentalists and the spiritualists of the 19th century with their Ouija boards and their seances, communing with the dead, trying to speak to the spirits. And all of this influences this landscape, Mount Auburn Cemetery. So it was established in 1831 by the Massachusetts Horticultural Society in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It takes its cues from places like the Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. It also follows English garden traditions. And we want to create an open green space with green grass and hills and trees and ponds. And even the monuments themselves are different shapes and sizes and different materials itself. When Mount Auburn first opens, it becomes a tourist attraction, and it still is a tourist attraction today. And people are flocking to it because it is not only just this newfangled idea about how to bury the dead, but it is also open green space 4 miles outside of downtown, dirty, filthy, industrialized 19th century Boston. This is an example of a rural garden cemetery in Pembroke. This is Mount Pleasant Cemetery. It's right along one of your main routes. It's a lovely view as you drive by. And certainly there is more than one in town, and there are more than one in many towns. The idea was when Mount Auburn came about as a modern cemetery of the time, it sparks everybody else to follow in its footsteps. So we may add on to existing burial grounds and make more landscaped, more modern looking cemeteries, or we may find new space to make new cemeteries in a town, and they end up looking like that. One of the new things that we can do in these 19th century cemeteries is we can buy land. We can purchase a family plot. And the idea of the family plot, I call it a home away from home, or your vacation home. And it sounds funny, but if you think about it in terms of the family of the 19th century, they're all together, they're all interacting and communing with each other, just like families of today. So as you lose people one by one, they die and they go to the family plot in the cemetery. And it is the opportunity for the family one by one to come back together. The cemeteries of the time were very, very social spaces. You went in and you picnicked and you tended the stones and you planted flowers and you communed with nature and the spirits and your neighbors, your living neighbors as well, because it was a very common place for people to go and do all of those things. And it created a very social environment. We may take this family plot and we may put a fence around it. We may put curbing around it. We leave spaces, and you can almost see it on the right-hand side of this slide on the top. You can almost see between those two granite pillars the entryway to get in. It's a door, it's a front door, just like any other house. So if you have one family plot and another family plot and another family plot, you get an example like down below of the neighborhood. They really come together to make a living neighborhood. And I think in some of these, we've shown you that one of the things that you guys have, and we will get to it too, you actually have family plots that start on their own land and become burial spaces for extended family around town. And I found a number of them that were still in use. I found a number of them that, or I didn't find a number of them that should have been there, but are no longer visible for me for whatever reason. We've got a language of flowers in the 19th century, and we put flowers, we carved them on gravestones just like we carved the trees. And the idea about the flowers are like trees and like human lives. They have a definite beginning, they have a definite end, and they're fragile and can be interrupted at any time so that life can be cut short. So in my upper left-hand picture, I've got a bloom. I've got a flower that started, bloomed, and then the bloom fades, and often used as a symbol of the passage of a full life. Here, where that flower is inverted, I thought that was a really nice touch. If you ever see torches on 19th century gravestones, they are very often inverted, and it is the idea of life being extinguished. So I think putting this flower upside down on the stone is just that little extra message about the termination of that bloom of that life. Down below that, we've got a number of closed buds on that stone. And it's the idea of the flower that starts and the bud that starts, but never gets to bloom. And it's a reference to the idea of nipped in the bud. And if you look at the stems, where those just above those buds, you can see what looks like little breaks in the stem. So it's meant to show the fragility of life. These little buds are often used for children or young people. In this case, upon reading the stone, there's 3 closed buds on here, and it happens to be for 3 young children in a family. The promise of going home, that pointing finger on the left, on the right with the sentiment gone home, that is no different than the winged skull and the winged soul that we saw in the colonial period. It means exactly the same thing. It is more to come. It is the idea or the promise that there is more to come. Those shaking hands at the bottom indicate goodbye in this life, hello in the next. It is the promise that there is more after this. And it is just the modern symbol of the 19th century that replaces those winged skulls and winged souls. This is probably a really good place to talk about material in gravestones. So these are all marble. Marble is a new material for the 19th century newfangled cemetery. We have waterways and railroads, and we've got ships traversing the ocean that can bring marble back from farther away places, whether it's Vermont, the Midwest to the South, or even as far away as Carrara, Italy. And we now have the ability to get it and also use it, not just for big important buildings and monuments, but can also be used for everyday people's use as gravestones. Marble was chosen because it was newly available. It was chosen because it is in and of itself, it's symbolic. It's white, it's bright, it's symbolic of purity in heaven. The problem with marble is that geologically, it is a very porous stone. So it absorbs pollutants from the air and discolors like we see here. These are not white like they would have been when they were new. And also the granular structure of marble is not very hardy against wind and rain erosion. So while these guys can be cleaned and brought back to being white, like a good number of them that I saw in Mount Pleasant in Pembroke, once they have eroded, once that imagery is gone through erosion, it is gone. Much softer symbols in the 19th century. No more hatchets, no more skulls. again, the idea of a softer, easier, more pleasant transition from one world to the next. In the upper left-hand corner, I have a broken chain. So I have the idea of the family chain that has been broken, has been interrupted by a death. I'm having a little bit of trouble with the writing over the top of that because of erosion, but it says something to the effect of "our babe has gone home." And I was able to tease babe out of that because I've got that closed bud there. So I without looking back at my picture of the full stone, I'm able to easily interpret that symbol. Down below that, I've got a dove with a bud in its mouth. So doves are symbolic of the Holy Spirit. They are symbolic of peace. It may be carrying an olive branch like doves often do, also for peace. It looks like a bud to me on a little stem, but it is there for all of those reasons. Down below, I've got a lamb. He's actually in pretty good shape. Often when you see them, they're pretty melted from water and wind erosion from being outside. And they tend to look more like seals or dogs than lambs. But again, lambs are a symbol of innocence and again, very often used for young children. The wreath next to that, so that's again an idea of leaving flowers or having flowers, the idea of life being fragile. And also wreaths are typically circular. So when they are connected, it's a very obvious circle so that you get the message about life, death, and then more life after that continuous circle. On the right, I've got an anchor. An anchor is a symbol of hope. And then I saved my favorite for last, sleepers. And you have a couple of these in Mount Pleasant. This one was in pretty good condition comparatively. And I think it's because he's kind of carved into the niche. He's got some of the stone hanging over him. But that is a sleeper. So that is the idea of falling asleep and passing away. I wanted to show you these because I found them around town, both in the Briggs and I'm going to mutilate this, right? One way or another, I'm going to probably get it wrong. Sachem or Sachem, up to you. But anyway, these are the cemeteries that I found, these objects that I wanted you to know about because they're there in Pembroke. So the top left is called a table stone. The one underneath it is called a box tomb. So typically when I see these, they are for founding fathers in the town, prominent families, clergy often gets them as well. The one on the right is a shot of the top tablet that's on that box tomb, and it has a lot of family information on it. So this harkens back to the idea of in the church originally, you had crypts. So your wealthy patrons, your important people, your clergy were buried in the church in the crypt, and the crypt was typically under the altar, or at least under part of the altar, under the first floor of the church, the altar and the nave. And this is that idea of that altar out in the wild, if you will, out on the landscape, reminiscent of the idea of the crypt in the church, but found on the landscape. Also, do not let anybody tell you there is a body in that box. No bodies in the box tombs that are outside on the landscape. This may just be 4 walls of brick. It might be a solid mass of brick, but there is no body inside that box. The body is still buried in the ground. I also found these around town. I wanted you to know about them. They're called hill tombs. So there's one on the top, and then there's one on the lower left. The picture on the right is a back shot of the facade on the lower left of the hill tomb on the lower left, so that you can actually see the hill. So it is a facade that behind it has got a chamber. typically brick or granite, typically vaulted. You can see the arc of the vault if you look at that picture on the bottom right. And then it's that vault is covered with sod. They've got front doors. The family held keys to the doors. They went in. You go in, you open the door, and oftentimes you go down a set of stairs, and it opens up into the chamber. You're standing under that vault underground. You bring your caskets in, and you leave them inside this chamber. They are not put in the ground. They are left inside the chamber. Most of the time when I see these, they've been sealed up. They may or may not have remains in them. The remains might be sealed up with the vault. They might be removed and then sealed. It has to do with keeping unwanted people out. It keeps animals out. Theoretically, they can still dig through. And also, without maintenance, these things can be unstable and can be dangerous. So when you find them, if you look on the lintel over the door, you will see the name and the family, the burial vault or tomb. I've got a date, and then on the lower one, that panel tells me, on the panel on the top tells me who's in there and dates. And then the panels on both sides of the brickwork had just names. Actually, this one on the left, I think just said Rogers, and the other one was blank. So it might have been the possibility that we were going to use them for more families. Maybe we did and didn't inscribe them, or maybe we didn't. And you will notice that there's a little box tomb. There's on the top of that hill tomb, and that's the box tomb we saw in the previous example. I wanted you to know about this too around town. So you can see that orange car back there. That's me, proof I was there. This is the Friends Meeting House and Cemetery from 1789. The Friends are the Quakers. This was their meeting house. I very often see Friends meeting houses that have cemeteries, burial grounds adjacent to them. And one of the things that I find interesting about the way their tombstones are made is their dating system. So you've got Ann Baker, and then it says died 8th month 1789. So 8th month, August the 16th, 1789. I couldn't purport to tell you why it's like that, but I see the Quakers like that. It's on my to-research list. As we get into the close of the 1800s and move steadily into the 20th century, there's a lot going on yet again. So we have our third phase of gravestone and cemetery evolution in the modern cemeteries of the 20th and the 21st century. A tremendous amount is happening. There is a backlash. Queen Victoria dies in 1901, and thereafter there is a backlash against all of the over ornamentation, over sentimentality, high emotion that marks the majority of the 19th century, where she set so many trends for art and architecture and behavior, including mourning. So we have an arts and crafts movement that takes place in England, makes its way over to us. And it is a simplification in the land of the living. We tone down our architecture. We tone down our furniture. We change everything about the land of the living. So of course, we're going to change it in the land of the dead as well. So we want to return that cemetery to a more pastoral look. We want to make it easier on the eye. We want to make it less frenetic of a landscape with our modern perspective compared to what we were seeing in the Victorian time. So therefore, we change it to look like something like this. We change it because of modern groundskeeping. We have to mow the lawn and keep the place looking good, and we've got a budget of time and money to do it. We have new gravestone material in granite. Granite is metamorphic rock that is created at the molten core of the earth. And it takes very powerful tools that the industrial age brings us, pneumatic tools, so air powered and steam powered, to cut this stone, get it out of the ground, and then work it. Again, not just for big, impressive buildings and monuments, but for something more simple or more daily as regular gravestones. Couple other things that are happening. We are cheating death on a regular basis as we come out of the 1800s and roar medically through the 1900s into current time. Medicine changes at an amazingly rapid rate. Medicine moves from being art to being science. So we start out with the basics. We start out by really understanding about bacteria and viruses, how they are spread, what makes us sick. We get antibiotics on a larger scale. We understand how to keep our water clean so that it doesn't make us sick. We understand how to better preserve our food so that it doesn't make us sick. And medicine then just vaults from there into the 21st century, where we are replacing organs. If you wait another couple of years, it isn't far away. We will be 3D printing replacement organs. We are mapping our human genome. We are doing surgery on babies before they're born to correct defects that otherwise would be life-threatening. So all of this allows us to extend our lives, live better quality lives, and really cheat death on that regular basis. So the cemetery is someplace we don't go so much anymore. And death takes a really not just a backseat, but gets closeted as an unpleasant topic that we only talk about in hushed tones and really only when we have to. Unlike the Victorians before us who did nothing but talk about death. And the colonials really before them, because it happened to them as an everyday occurrence and a very much a fact of life, because they did not have the medical advances that we enjoy today. The other thing that changes as we come out of the 1800s and into the 1900s is we stop being sick and dying at home. So originally you got sick, you typically died in your home. Your family took care of you while you were sick. Your family prepared your body for the wake that took place in the house and the funeral that may have taken place in the house before you then move on to the procession to the cemetery to be buried. Now we've moved into the idea of embalming. It starts with the Civil War and then takes hold in the civilian world pretty quickly. So as we come out of the 1800s, we are embalming, and we have funeral directors that are coming, removing the body from wherever it is that we die, whether it's at home or possibly more likely in a hospital setting or another type of care facility, takes it away. And really, we sanitize death by letting them do that. We take ourselves out of the equation. We give the dead one to the funeral director, who then goes about doing the best work they can to make the dead person look alive again, so that we can have a viewing and we can ponder the idea of how lifelike they look. So all of this puts death in the closet. And what happens on this modern landscape is, because we go here less and less, because we talk about it less and less, our gravestones typically don't say a lot. So they might have a name, they'll have the family name, and then they'll have the individual's names, and they will have birth dates and death dates, or birth years and death years, but really not a whole lot more in between. It doesn't allow me to meet somebody or see an individual or see a family, or really even see what's going on in society on a broader scale at any particular point in time. The good news is, I would say as of about the 80s, it really became mainstream for people to want to put information and things on their gravestones that gave it personality, whether they chose to put it on there themselves or that the family chose to have this kind of personalization happen to the gravestones that they put up for loved ones. So this is the part where I remind you that the next couple of slides, you may see somebody you know, so don't freak out. We do it, we put these things on our stones because now as modern people, we want to say who we were. So we get pictures. I get faces. I can see the people that I may have existed contemporaneously with, but have not had an opportunity to meet because of the limitations of space and time. So in the upper left-hand corner, that couple is, that photo is, it's the piece itself is called a photo ceramic. So it's a photo that is put onto a piece of ceramic and then sealed up and attached to the gravestone. Photoceramics are pretty popular and they've been used all through the, I see them all through the 20th century. They are kind of fragile in that if the lawnmower throws rocks at them, they can chip and break. But they're out there and they're sealed up and they're supposed to be weathering the storm, as it were. The couple next to that photo ceramic, that's called an etching. So our popular modern gravestone material for the last 30 years or so has been black granite. So when you go in the cemetery and you see the black shiny gravestones, they are typically black polished granite, which really lend themselves to doing imagery. So the etchings like this are done sometimes by laser, but more often they're done by people with great talent and diamond tip tools that work to etch in stitch by stitch into the stone to bring the picture that we see on the landscape. And it's not an uncommon thing to have pictures of people on gravestones. And I wanted to, I'm using this one, I found it in Mount Pleasant. Down below, the Olive's gravestone there has got a cutout in it. You're looking right through it to the grass behind it. Originally, I'm going to say that there was a photo in there. And that gravestone dates to a death in 1855. And remember, you don't always get a gravestone the minute you die, but it is certainly a 19th century gravestone with a cutout in it that I believe held a photograph. And sometimes even the shape and size of the cutout would be able to tell me what period the photo was done, whether it was a daguerreotype, an ambrotype, or a tintype. Photography was invented in 1839, and it takes off pretty quickly and becomes pretty available, commonly available across the board, whether you had money or not. And it would certainly be quite modern at the time to put a photo in there. I will say that there was probably something on the back of that stone that closed that hole up and protected the back of the photo, as well as there was probably glass on the front also to protect the photo. So we can see the individuals. We put things on our gravestone that we want to talk about who we were. So we were married December 29th in 1994. We served in the military, in the Navy as Seabees, or in the Marine Corps. We put pictures of our businesses. That truck is somebody's business. Read that closely and you'll see. And we also talk about who we were as a nationality. I'm Irish, I'm Italian, I'm French, I'm whatever. Here I've got I think I've got an Irishman with that claddagh, the shamrock, and the Celtic cross. So we want to say who we were, but we also want to say the things we enjoyed. What did we do with ourselves while we were here? And I see people's pets all the time on their gravestones because our pets are very important to us. They're very much like members of the family. What did we do with our spare time? Well, we went to visit Mickey. We loved Disneyland and Disney World. We watched the stars. We love our lighthouses along the East Coast, and even not just the East Coast, but I see a lot of lighthouses on gravestones all over the place because we truly love the sea and we love our lighthouses. And certainly we have boats, we have motorcycles, we do things with our free time to get out and enjoy the world. This is something I wanted you to see that's a modern fixture on the modern cemetery of the 21st century. This is in Mount Pleasant. This is called a columbarium. And what it is, you can see it's kind of got its own little pavilion, kind of squared off with a foundation. It's got a couple benches for sitting. And then that structure has all those little niches. You see those boxes? Those are all individual niches that would be for cremains. So the same way you would buy a grave plot in the ground, you can buy a niche in the columbarium, and then that's where that urn goes. And you take the panel off, the urn goes inside, and then it is sealed up. So it's just an alternate modern method of putting your loved one in the cemetery. And it is also a way for the cemetery to continue to be able to offer space for interments and inurnments in this case, in the case of cremains, because they need to keep making money. The grass isn't going to mow itself. So modern columbarium and modern cemeteries in general, right now, here and now, in 2020, our modern cemeteries are actually some of our older cemeteries, particularly our garden cemeteries. I see this all over the country. Modern cemeteries and folks, rural garden cemeteries of the 19th century are doing things to engage the public. We are doing more than just hosting walks, hosting tours through these burial spaces. We're doing all of these things on the list and then some. We're keeping bees. We have hives on the grounds, and those hives are helping the flowers and the trees, as well as we harvest the honey and we sell it. So it makes some money for the cemetery. And I can tell you, any place I know that any cemetery that keeps hives on the grounds, they have a waiting list for the honey before it even leaves the hive. We have dog parks. Now, I know this may sound odd to people, but it works, and I've seen it in action. The idea of paying a fee to be able to bring your dog into the cemetery and let them run off leash. Shocking, right? But perfectly doable and really quite smart. So a congressional cemetery in Washington, D.C. is the example I always use for this, because they've been at it for 15 years or more. You sign up, you pay a pretty penny to be a member. You are allowed to come in and let your dog run. You are responsible to clean up after your dog. If you do not, everybody knows who the offender is. You lose your membership privileges, you lose your deposit. And believe me, there are people waiting in line to avail themselves of this great service for them and their dogs in the cemetery. It is open green space. Where are you going to run your dog in open green space in places like Washington, D.C.? It makes money for the cemetery. It engages the community. And if it's followed and maintained, it's just a genius idea. We do poetry readings. We have parties in the cemeteries. How many weddings do we know of in cemeteries? A lot. Birthday parties, engagements in the cemetery. We can go have dinner and see a movie in the cemetery. We can do yoga in a peaceful setting that is a cemetery. And we can do 5K runs, because it's 5K. It's not a marathon. It lasts like 35 minutes. It's a way, again, to get people into the cemetery and raise money for the cemetery. We can engage in book club, the idea of reading something together collectively as a group and engaging in the subject matter and engaging in the cemetery as well. In the upper right-hand corner is an example of an art market that I love to do. This is Laurel Hill Cemetery. This is the Gravestone Girls booth in Laurel Hill Cemetery. One Saturday in September every year, with the exception of this year, there is an art market from 12 noon until 5 p.m. It brings 2,000 or more people through the gates at $5 a head. Whammo, $10,000 raised right there for the cemetery. And that money, plus what the vendors pay, plus what the food trucks, plus all of the other membership that they get out of it, all the other money that is raised that day goes right back into the cemetery. It goes certainly for landscaping, it goes for monument repair, and it goes for more education. We may hold death cafes. This is a new thing, relatively new thing that we're doing in the cemetery. The idea of coming together in a safe space to sit and talk, and it's like a coffee cafe. You sit and you talk, and your subject matter is about death and dying and mortality, and having ears to listen and being able to talk about a subject that might be difficult for some people in a more inviting and welcoming sense, in a more welcoming location. All of these things come together, including modern technology and the QR code. We use QR codes in mobile apps to take tours of cemeteries on our own time. We can download it and we can hear all sorts of information about monuments and people and learn a tremendous amount at our own pace going through the cemetery. And we're all getting really familiar with QR codes now, right? Because of the pandemic and all the touch-free stuff. Genius. I will tell you that it has been being used by the memorial industry for 20 plus years or more. It's actually in its second generation. On the left, that QR code has been enlarged for your viewing purposes, but look down below that to the woman with the cell phone. It's about 1 inch in diameter. It has been installed into the gravestone. It is called a memory medallion. It is made by the Memory Medallion Company in Pennsylvania that holds the US patent for using QR technology, both for historical interpretation as well as memorialization. So the idea is you buy your little memory medallion from the company and you get it plugged into your stone. It can be adhered to the front of the stone, or it can be flush mounted the way it is here. And that QR code allows people with cell phones, which is most of us, and nowadays you don't even need a special app to read a QR. All you do is turn on your camera, and if you want to do it, you can do it right now and follow along. Scan that QR code with your phone, and it's going to take you to our spokesmodel for Memory Medallion. Her name is Sarah Buchanan. This is her particular Memory Medallion website. She has 999 spaces to do anything she wants with it, and you would have the same. So you can put your writings, you can put your pictures, genealogist, put your genealogy information on there. Anything you want to say who you were and what did you do while you were here. It's a very modern thing to do. And Mrs. Buchanan, among other things like blue and being her favorite color and daisies being her favorite flower, she used her Memory Medallion website to do a 15-minute video on her famous family caramel recipe, where she bosses her adult son around the kitchen while she teaches us how to make the famous family caramel recipe. So really proof that you can do whatever you want with with this modern technology. It really goes that extra step as being modern people to being able to talk about who we were and what we enjoyed long after we were here. There's just a couple more I wanted to show you. You got to know about these because you've got them around town. They are called white bronze. They're affectionately known as zingies. They were made by the Monumental Bronze Company in Bridgeport, Connecticut from the 1870s into the 19-teens. And let's walk through this for a second. So on the right is a Civil War memorial that is right in the middle of the town. It's right in front of the church, and it's right across from Center Cemetery. And it was just fabulous when I walked around it and saw that bas-relief casting of Mr. Lincoln up at the top there. And then there is an example below it. And then those little, where it says mother and father, I call them pillow stones. I don't really know what they're called. I like to call them pillows. Those are in Scoosett, or the Paul Magoon Family Cemetery. And then above that is one for the Turner's little girl with just a beautiful dove on the top of it. And so it's a front, the left one is the front of the monument, and the other picture next to it is the back of the monument. And it even says remembered still, because she is. It's 2020, and we're still talking about that little Turner girl. So these are neither white nor are they bronze. They were made by the Monumental Bronze Company as a direct competitor to stone monuments, but also bronze monuments of the late 19th century. Bronze had a certain cachet to it because it was newly available, it was expensive. So we've got vases and statuary and doors and plaques in bronze on the cemetery landscape. The problem with bronze is it needs maintenance. Left without any kind of maintenance, it oxidizes very quickly and goes from being that beautiful bronze color to being black and green and streaky. So Monumental Bronze Company, capturing the word bronze because it was so recognizable, came out with these white bronzes. And they were not bronze. They are made out of zinc. They're almost pure zinc that is smelted at the foundry, poured into molds, and then the molded pieces are then assembled into what we see on the landscape. They did not have any showrooms. Everything was made in Bridgeport, Connecticut, but they had 4 affiliates, 3 in this country and 1 in Canada that helped coordinate orders for regions. And they were sold by basically traveling with design books where you would be able to sit down and customize your own modern monument. So it's modern of the time because it's new material. It's modern of the time because it hasn't been done before. It's modern at the time because it's super customizable. And the thing that is its direct hit against bronze is that the zinc is a natural biocide and needs no maintenance. So the promise was, as they were selling these, as it looks today, it will look like that for as long as the monument stands. And it's true. We don't see any biological growth on these things. They might get some dirt thrown on them from the rains or the lawnmower, but they are not going to grow their own biological growth and be obscured. They don't need any maintenance. They're always going to look this good. When you find these guys, which around Pembroke is pretty easy, now that you know what they are, if you didn't before, now that you know, when you see them, they're just going to jump out of the landscape at you. They really do kind of show up. They don't blend so well. But when you see one, walk up to it and give it a little tap. If someone answers, run. However, what's going to happen, what should happen, is that it is hollow and has no internal armature. So it should return a hollow metallic sound. And 2 other things I wanted to point out here. The monument below the bust of Mr. Lincoln, if you look, there's a little black spot on it right above the date. That is not a spot, that is a hole. So there is a piece of this missing. If you have the opportunity to find, if you find one where it's open, these plaques were screwed on where everything else was welded together, or not welded together. Molten zinc was put in between the pieces to hold the seams together. And then the plaques were, the name plaques, like here on the Civil War guy and down below, those were bolted on so that they could be changed. If you needed to add somebody, you could have a new plaque cast. And because they're hollow and no internal armature, they will, it's called creep. They start to compact under their own weight. And your Civil War guy here on the far right, if you notice, he is pitching to the left. And that is because he's heavy and there is no structure inside to hold him up. So he is very, very slowly creeping. He is crushing under his own weight. When you're out there, I want you to read them. I don't want you to just look at the art, because you will be amazed at what you see. And these were but a few that I thought were of good note. The one on the left, the 2 Chandlers, Philip died. It looks like the little markers on them, and certainly the flag and the guns will tell me that they're Civil War, that they both served. But if you read about Lucius, that second entry there said that he died in a rebel prison in February 1866. So he was still in prison almost a year after the close of the Civil War, if I understand that stone correctly. And we moved around as well. We tend to think people were pretty stationary and they stayed all in one place. But down below on the sort of left, that says that Miss Minerva was born in Campo, Brazil, and died in High Point, Florida. And her gravestone is in Pembroke. Now, she may or may not be there under that stone. If she is, then that's her grave and her gravestone. If she is not there, and we have a stone, that's the word we use for that. That's called a cenotaph, Cenotaph. And it is the idea that we have a marker with no body. It's still someplace to go to visit, and it's certainly left to be a memorial. And then over on the right, Mr. Moses Smith was shipwrecked on the coast of North Carolina and died from injury and exhaustion. And again, we don't know if he's there or not. We may be able to deduce that he died from injury and exhaustion. But if he's not there, again, we've got a cenotaph. If he is there, then this is his grave and his gravestone. So my job has been this evening to tell you all about gravestones and cemeteries. I warned you I could talk about this to the ends of the earth, and I already have. But I hope I have been able to impart that cemeteries are fun places. They're interesting and educational. They are living art museums. They are living history museums. They are free and open to the public. You can go explore almost anytime you want. Don't go at night. It's dark. There's a lot of trip hazards, and somebody may call the cops. So I want you to get out there and explore. Do it tomorrow. The weather's going to be good. And even if it's not, put your raincoat on and go look. So one last little plug for Gravestone Girls. In the time of pandemic, we are starting to do some real markets again. I'm getting on the road to go to West Virginia on Thursday and Friday for a market there on Saturday. And we'll also be participating on a virtual market on Halloween proper itself. So check those out. And like I said before, if you are not already following us on social media, on Facebook and Instagram, you find us at Gravestone Girls. We are always doing stuff. We're not just writing about what we're doing, but we're also writing about all kinds of other things that we see going on in the world of gravestones and cemeteries. And we always have something to tell you about. One last thing before we go to questions. On the girls' website is a section called Learn. So not only can you shop for all the Gravestone Girls goods and check the calendar of where we are and what we're doing, the section called Learn has got a lot of links to additional reading and websites so you can explore some more. And there are also a number of handouts, a glossary of terms, and sort of like a dictionary of symbols and meanings that you can download and print out so that you can have them. It references a lot of the stuff that I covered tonight. So I am going to turn it back over to my librarian, and let's see if we put anything in. Let's see if I can stop that share and get you all back on the big screen. Excellent. So where is my librarian? There she is.
Hello, I'm here.
Excellent. So if you have put any questions in the chat, Stephanie will help me out with that. And we'll answer some questions. And if not, we'll just get on with our lives and go have some dinner or a glass of wine or margarita.
So I don't see any questions in the chat yet, but I do have a question from one of my coworkers.
Okay.
Who wanted me to ask you if there is a difference between tombs and mausoleums.
Oh, you betcha. So let's be a little more specific. So the hill tomb that I showed you, which I have now stopped sharing my screen, so I can't go back. But the hill tombs that I showed you in town are tombs in that they're built into the wall. They're built into the ground. They're built into the hill, and it is a chamber that you go in through the door and you put your caskets in there. in the church where you put the caskets into the wall or into vaulted chambers like that. That's the crypt, but they're also tombs, sort of. And a mausoleum, so singular, here's your vocabulary word for the day. Mausoleum is singular. Mausolea is plural, but we tend to just say mausoleums. Mausoleums are freestanding structures. So they hold the bodies inside the structure in niches rather than being just put in the room the way they are in places like the hill tombs, but they are a completely freestanding structure. They are a building unto themselves. They can be very small and hold one or two. They can be, I've seen them for families where they have 30 or 40 niches. And we also have a concept of the community mausoleum, in that it is a whole building full of niches. Remember the columbarium we saw with the little niches for the urns? You can have a mausoleum or a community mausoleum that has niches just for urns, which is inurnment, or niches that will hold a casket. So for entombment. So yeah, there's still tombs, but definitely a mausoleum is different from a hill tomb or other types of tomb structures.
Thank you. And I see a raised hand from Miles.
Sure, let's see if we can unmute him here. I've asked you to unmute, Miles. Let's see if it works.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I'm Miles Prescott. I'm with the Pembroke Historical Society. I've worked with Stephanie in collaboration on a number of areas over the last few years.
Fabulous.
And so the Seth Hatch Cemetery, you're referring to the Packett's Landing, is that? That's what we were.
All of those guys along Water Street.
Yeah. It's Packett's Landing Street.
Yeah. Yeah. So good. Maybe you can answer this for me. When I got down to Packett's Landing, I found a new development, a relatively new housing development. And I had an atlas that showed two little burial grounds, which I think might have been a couple of those Magoons or Waters or Hatches, or a number of those that I couldn't find. So I was curious to know if had they been there, and did we lose them because of development, or are they now maybe on private property because of the development? I was wondering how my guessing skills were.
There may be, I have a friend that lives on Water Street, and there may be some other smaller family ones, but I haven't been to the Packett's Landing one, but we, since Seth Hatch was there and he was one of the Pembroke Resolve signers, we found that grave there, and it wasn't properly decorated because he was in the French Indian War and also the Revolutionary War. Yep. So I don't know if you're talking about, that one was called, we thought it was called Packett's Landing, but sometimes I think 2 Mile Cemetery gets mixed up with some of the other ones too.
It does, because if I looked at, so I use a lot of resources to go out and do this kind of work. And certainly one of them is Find a Grave. So you always take your Find a Grave information with a grain of salt. But
right.
I did see an entry in Find a Grave that said that the Seth Hatch family cemetery was in 2 Mile in Pembroke, but I think you also have a 2 Mile cemetery in another surrounding town. Yeah.
There's one in Marshfield. There's one in Marshfield as well.
Yep.
Because part of the 2 Mile area was in Scituate and there was some in Marshfield. So, but I do know the Brown Cemetery was actually, that's on High Street.
Yeah.
Okay, it is
so
on,
that
it's
High
on
Street
private.
Seemed to be a lot of spaces. It seemed to be at one point a lot of small family burial grounds, or just family burial grounds.
They were big. They were well-traveled roads. So the Brown family Samuel Brown was the father, and that house was built in 1775. It's still standing, but the graves, there's 6 graves that are on the street, but they're at one of 3 houses. But if you came back into town, we could scope around, but I have a feeling it's behind one of 3 houses. But the son, one of Samuel Brown's sons was Moses Brown, and he had a Quaker school on the property, which was later moved across the street. But there's a Moses Brown that's in Providence, the Providence Quaker school, but that's not the same one. It's a descendant.
Oh, okay. Yeah, he's buried in North Burial Ground. I happen to know him well. Ha!
That Moses Brown? Yeah.
That's
I think some people think it's the same person, but it's not.
Sure.
But there's a family connection. Also, the Samuel Brown's mother was a Gould, and the Goulds, some of them were supposed to be buried in the Friends Quaker Meeting House. One of them was in the Pembroke Resolve, Samuel Gould.
Yep.
But he and another person on here, Tracy Marino, we were looking at the meeting house, and there's probably at least a dozen graves that are missing. So
Sure.
we need to get one of those grave detectors out there.
Yep. Yeah, and it's something that I should have said when I was talking about the Colonial Cemetery too. What you see now has not only changed over time, but you most likely we always have more interments than we have gravestones, certainly. So the historic record that I was able to find about the Brown Cemetery says that the exact location is not known. So if it's known, we should make sure that we get some good documentation on that. You
Okay.
have got all those folks on Water Street and High Street, and they're Magoons, and they're this family and that family. And I was out there with I'm in my car with my maps and my paper and my phone, and Find a Grave and Macris and all that stuff, kind of going, how do I piece this together? Because if it's on the list, I want to find it. So
Okay.
I like to be thorough. So
We'll stay in touch then.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Can I help anybody else, or are we good for the evening?
We have a question from Susan who said, have you ever heard of someone recording a last words message that plays when visitors push a button on their grave marker? I thought I read about that feature being introduced recently.
I've heard about it. I have not seen it. So that little memory medallion thing that I mentioned, I know that they've been around for quite a while. That little QR one is actually 2nd generation. Memory medallion used their first generation of it was, do you remember PDAs that we used to have, personal data assistants, before we had cell phones? You would have basically a connecting rod, a connecting cord, that if you found the first generation of memory medallion, you plugged your cord into it, attached it to your PDA, and then you would get video, or you would get whatever the content of that is. I will say that there used to be a place called Vidstone, and they were about the same time as memory medallion, maybe a little earlier. I don't see them around anymore, but yeah, they actually manufactured a box, like a 7-inch box that had a cover, and you mounted this on the gravestone, and the cover closed and opened. And when you opened the cover, you saw a video screen, and you push the button and you get that person's recording. All of this stuff has existed at one point or continues to exist, but I will tell you, I have not seen it in the Northeast. We are still just as puritanical as we were when we got here 400 years ago. Though, and it's also why you don't see a lot of the modern activities that I've outlined about dog walking and beekeeping and parties and all of that stuff. I don't see that happening here in the Northeast in our cemeteries. if you go to New York or Ohio or pretty much any other place, they are doing all kinds of stuff like that, particularly the privately held ones versus the municipally owned ones. But it all exists, but I'm yet to see it here in the Northeast.
We have a question from Tracy, who asks if you are aware of any place in the area that offers ground penetrating radar to locate missing or unmarked graves.
That's a great question. And really, it should be something that's on the Girls Learn page, because we've worked with them before. I haven't worked with them specifically, but I've been around on different projects where ground penetrating radar was brought in. Yeah, so I can't remember, I don't know anybody doing it locally, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. They certainly do. You might want to check it just as a point of reference with this, because they will often employ people to bring in their ground penetrating radar and try and look for not just graves and cemeteries, but other things like the original powder houses or things like that. If you guys don't know what ground penetrating radar is, it is what it sounds like. It used to be this big, giant piece of equipment, and now it kind of just looks like a lawnmower. And the technician rolls it across the landscape at a relatively slow and even pace. And what it's doing is shooting radar into the ground, and the radar is bouncing off the underground soil and returning imagery in what's that called? Like the heart monitor, kind of like this. I don't remember what it's called, but line points. And what it's looking for is disturbances in the ground. And that just means the soil is like this, and then it's like this. It's high here, it's low here, it's this, it's that. So ground penetrating radar does not take a picture underground and shows you, oh, there's a skeleton. We don't see that. We just see disturbances in the ground, but it can be very useful in trying to determine where disturbances are and what they might be, that you can then maybe do some preliminary excavations or other kinds of studies of old maps and documents to try and figure out where things were. It not only has the technology shrunken down in terms of the apparatus itself, but the cost of it has come down significantly as well. And while I can't think of anybody offhand in Massachusetts, the state archaeologists are very familiar with this. So if somebody's looking for them, start with your state archaeologist.
That was our last question.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody. My thanks to the library for hosting this evening. I think we did a pretty good job pivoting to virtual. We're already having a conversation about doing something live next year, hopefully next year. When things are better, we'll do another in-person program. Maybe we'll go for a walk in the cemetery. Everybody, again, thanks for coming tonight and hanging out. Remember to follow us on social media. And if you come up with questions after the fact, you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and go, oh my God, I wish I had asked her. You know how to find us. Send us an email or drop us a line, and we'd love to chat some more. And we'd also like to see what you guys are out there finding. So enjoy it. Have fun. Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much, Steph. Have a wonderful night, everybody.